by way of introduction, I'm Rob Van Dam. I work at Bluehost. We are currently hiring for devs, sysadmins, QA, tech support. So if you do one or all of those things, please come talk to me afterwards. How many people in this room are developers or consider yourself developers? Okay. How many are QA in the realm of QA at all? Sysadmin, sysarcs, DBA, anybody? Tech writers, bloggers? Okay, just getting a sense of who I'm talking to. So, how many of you have contributed to an open source project of any kind, anywhere, at any time? A few, okay. And who wants to do more of that? Okay, good. Otherwise, I don't know why you're here. So, you've probably thought to yourself, I would like to contribute to open source. That sounds like a good idea. But I suck. I'm not very good at this thing. I'm a new programmer. I know a language that nobody else cares about. I don't have a lot of time to work on this. I don't know where to start. I go to GitHub and there's 80 billion different repos out there, and what the heck am I supposed to do with all of this open source code and no starting point? There's definitely no pointer that says start here. Well, you're probably already using open source at some point, at some place in your life. I know that I am. My laptop is open source. This is running Linux. My family desktop is. Home media center is. Unfortunately, my Apple iPhone is not, but I work in an open source programming language, on an open source operating system, talking to an open source billing system in my regular day job. I write in other open source languages in my free time. So open source is scattered throughout my life. But how many of those different things have I actually contributed to? Well, not that long ago I realized none of them. I've written some modules for Perl here and there. You can find my name on CPAN. I've got some GitHub repos, but never really made a point to actually look through the things that I use and find a way that I can contribute back to those to make those better. They certainly make my life a lot better. I don't have to run Windows, so my life is awesome. But I've not done anything to help with that. So I thought I need to find a way to improve my contributions back to these different communities that I'm making use of, that I'm getting a huge benefit from, but I'm not really helping out in any way. And so this talk is a little bit of the journey that I went through in figuring out some of the ways that I could do that. So we're going to go through why, who, where, when, what, and how. And technically it's not unordered, it's reverse alphabetical, but you know, don't worry about that. So, why? Why would I want to contribute? Well, I want to be able to give back. Like I said, I'm getting a lot of benefit. Other people are giving into these projects generally for free. We all know that there's lots of corporate sponsorship of open source projects as well, and that's fine. But a lot of people give a lot of their free time into open source, and I would like to give back to that a little bit. Since I'm not paying money for it, maybe I could pay in some of my time, my effort, my skill set, my expertise. It can give me a sense of purpose. Why am I a programmer? Am I just doing it so that I can spend 9 to 5 making money for another company? Or am I also doing it to grow myself, to help other people expand? A lot of people get very, very passionate about their favorite open source projects. And if you right now want to have a passion, but you don't, an open source project is a great place to develop that. Obviously, you get community for free. You get all these other people who are working on something else that you can learn from and that you can provide your own expertise to, that they can learn from as well. And then personal growth. Maybe right now you're a Java programmer, but you'd really love to learn that newfangled Ruby thing that people keep talking about. So you go and find a Ruby project to work on, and you get an excuse to learn Ruby doing something that's real. Not to knock all of the great websites that are out there that will teach you programming languages, but if you just keep writing hello world over and over again, your Python skills, your Ruby skills, whatever other thing you're trying to learn are just not going to be that great. But if you dive into, say, OpenStack, and you write some little feature, could be just 5 lines of code, 10 lines of code, something like that, in an OpenStack module somewhere, you're going to know way more Python from that than all of the tutorials that you walk through to learn Python. So, who should contribute? We went through and I kind of asked around who was a dev in this room, other type of positions. Did anybody not raise their hand for any of the questions that I asked? Dev, QA, sysadmin, anything? Anything else in that group?
Just a firewall and network guy.
Network, NetOps, perfect. A lot of open source tools in that realm as well. So this answer is really kind of obvious, but the answer is you. And I don't mean the you that you want to be someday. I don't mean the you once you've figured out all the things you wanted to figure out, once you've become a perfect programmer, a perfect writer, a perfect whatever it is you think you ought to be. I don't mean once you've learned that new language that you want to learn, or learn that new skill set, learn some tool or whatever. I mean, you guys right now in this room could be right now on your laptops contributing to open source while I talk if you wanted to. You could walk out of this room being able to contribute to open source, because whatever skill set you have, somebody needs that. You might not know the language for the first repo you look at, or the first project you look at. That's fine. There's 1,000 others, 10,000 others that could use some of the skill sets that you currently have right now. So don't worry about waiting until you've learned whatever that thing is that you want to learn. You're going to learn a lot of that while you contribute, while you work through the kinds of problems you'll run into, because let's face it, you can learn in a classroom setting like this all you want, but application of those skills is where they really start to sink in. So just to reiterate, you. No matter your expertise, no matter your skill sets, you can do it. So, where? Well, the simplest places to start are usually the things you already know. So I rattled off some things that I use. Linux, this is Ubuntu. I've also used Red Hat, CentOS. You could look at library frameworks, things like jQuery, Mojolicious, any of the kinds of whatever your favorite language is. Maybe there's a Ruby gem that you use all the time, but it's got some little bug that's constantly nagging you. Well, if you can fill in this sentence, I love blank, but I wish it would something, then you can contribute to whatever X is, because you have a thought that will make that better. And you may find, you'll often find, in fact, that whenever you have that thought and you go and look, somebody else has already filed a bug report or made a feature request or has an issue on GitHub or whatever the tracking is. Or you talk to the owner, maintainer of whatever the main repo is, if it's one person, or the community on their forum, whatever that communication looks like. Somebody else has probably already thought of the same thing but just doesn't have the time to do it. So you could be that person. So, second where. A lot of people think open source and they think of things like the Linux kernel. And that's intimidating. The Linux kernel is huge. It's this big, ugly, nasty thing that I know nothing about. And I will never understand. And so I think I can't contribute to open source because I don't know that. But there's tons of other kinds of open source things. I picked off a bunch of random things that you probably wouldn't have thought of as things that you could contribute to. But whatever your specialties are, if you're a developer, if you know one of these languages or any of the other 1,000 languages out there, there are libraries that need help that can be contributed to. And you can find things in those libraries or in those languages that meet your skill sets today, or the skill sets you'd like to have, but you can start contributing at an early point. And of course, if you're a C guru, then go for it. Linux kernel always needs a little more help too. So here's some ideas of places where you can find repos. If you don't, off the top of your head, you can't think of something you'd like to contribute to, or something that everything you do think of is too intimidating to you, start with GitHub. Everything's on GitHub at this point. GitHub.com/explore. The colors are a little washed out there. You can't see the text all that well. But this is just a pretty interface for randomly exploring through interesting, popular projects that are currently on GitHub. If GitHub isn't your cup of tea, there are other things like this out there. Bitbucket is a common alternative. But GitHub has a ton of things. And even if people aren't using GitHub as their final true repository, they often have a copy of their repo that they're posting to GitHub just because it's free and they can and it makes life easier. So this is a starting point. This is very undirected, right? You're just going to drill down into things and look around and find what's interesting to you. Another option on GitHub is their showcases link. All of these are right available at the top of GitHub, so they're not that hard to find. And this is a little bit more of a curated list of things. This is things that people at GitHub thought could be shown off as interesting. And they're grouped into categories, so you can drill down that way. If you're interested in games, there's a category for that. If you're interested in whatever it is, I can't read down here. Ooh, clean code linters. So you can work on lint, JS lint, JLint. What's the Java one I can't think of? That other one. Perl Critic for Perl. There's tons of those kinds of things out there. So if you're a nitpicker about your code, you can go and write code that nitpicks other people's code. It's awesome. And then there's trending. This one's curated in a different way. This is more just what's the popular things, what's getting a lot of activity, a lot of people either viewing their repos or commenting or creating bugs or just committing code even. So trending is a great place. When I grabbed this screenshot whenever it was, we had JSON server, zoom.js, and USB kill. Just happened to be at the top. So this is another place where you can see what are other people working on. And you can filter this based on language, by, is it trending today, this week, this month, all kinds of things. So you can get a sense of what's popular. Now maybe you don't want to dive into what's popular because that's intimidating, but you can also see kind of where ecosystems of things are, because another thing that's common is you might have an ecosystem like WordPress. WordPress is a big, huge, bulky piece of software, right? But WordPress isn't the only thing in the WordPress community that you can contribute to. There's also hundreds of WordPress plugins floating all over the place, most of which have really, really terrible security holes in them. You can be the one that fixes all of those terrible WordPress security holes. I shouldn't say that. We host a lot of WordPress, but it's true. OK, so another option. I don't want to explore. I'm too lazy. I can't figure this out. I want somebody else to just tell me what to do. I've got a number of very interesting options that I've played around with. 24pullrequest.com is pretty cool. You're going to have to wait till December for that one to come back online. But the idea is it's an advent calendar of pull requests. If you don't know what a pull request is, we'll get to that in a second. But think advent calendar of open source contribution. For 24 days in December, once a day, you do something that you contribute back to open source. It can be tiny. It can be fixing a typo, one typo in somebody's documentation somewhere. But 24 of them once a day for 24 days. It's actually a lot of fun, motivates you to look at things you might not have otherwise looked at, and gets you used to the idea of collaboration, of submitting code, submitting patches, submitting pull requests to other repositories, other people, and getting feedback on that. They might tell you, that's a terrible idea. I wanted that typo there. But you got to contribute, right? This isn't get 24 changes merged into master on 24 different things. This is make 24 requests to other sources of information. If you're a Perl guy, this is one that I'm big on right now, CPAN PRC. So this is the CPAN pull request challenge. CPAN is Perl's big, enormous library of tons of modules that get used all over the world. And right now they're doing a monthly pull request challenge. So once a month, you get randomly assigned a module that needs some help. And it's not all of Perl. It's just one module within Perl. This would fit kind of a Ruby gem or a module in a Python world. And you just get randomly assigned something where the developer needs some kind of help. It might be documentation, it might be bugs, it might be any number of things within that. It might be new features that have been requested. Maybe there was a maintainer and he doesn't care about it anymore and he wants to offload it to somebody else. Any of those kinds of things. You just get an email once a month that says, hey, go check out this thing. And it'll have a link to CPAN, it'll have a link to the GitHub repo, and some basic suggestions on things that you can do to improve that. As far as I know, nobody else is doing this kind of thing in other languages, but you could also make the thing that does this in other languages. The guy who's doing it for Perl just had an idea. It kind of snowballed really quickly, and now he's running it. But there's no reason it couldn't apply to any language just as easily. Code triage and docs doctor are also interesting. I'm signed up for code triage. I haven't done docs doctor because I really suck at writing. But code triage is cool. So it randomly scours through open issues on GitHub and sends you one. I think it's once a month. It might be more like once a week or something like that. Actually, it might even be as much as once a day. Maybe it's configurable. But it sends you this open issue, and it says, go figure out if this is a legitimate issue. Right? Because if you're a developer working on some big project like WordPress or jQuery or Homebrew or CakePHP or any of these others that I've mentioned, the Linux kernel, you probably don't have time to go and investigate the thousands of bugs that come into your system that are all duplicates of each other or not really legitimate or just because that guy's environment was broken. So maybe you don't have time, or maybe you don't have the skills to actually develop in that environment, but if you can figure out how to reproduce what that guy was having a problem with on whatever the issue that got sent to you was, that's saving somebody in that community time, and you are now contributing to open source because you're freeing up one of the developers' time to work on that tool. So code triage is cool. Docs doctor is the exact same thing, but now it's just for documentation. So it's sending you documentation. There's kind of two modes there. One is send me documented methods, and I will read through it and clean it up and make sure it all looks nice. The other one is send me completely undocumented methods. So here's a block of code. Write some documentation for this. Cool idea. Another two that I found that are fun, Code Montage and Open Hatch. These are basically just trying to be networking portals in a sense. Bunch of people have repos, bunch of developers have free time. Let's get those together somehow and figure out how to match them up so that the people who are working on the code who need developers don't have to spend all their time hunting people down who can help them, and the developers don't have to go browsing around on GitHub to figure out what they could contribute to. So that's Code Montage and Open Hatch. Very, very similar ideas at both, just slightly different sets of repos and focus and intent. I mentioned this, so you could start your own pull request challenge in whatever your favorite language or library or whatever it is. You could do this just at work. We ran a pull request hackathon at work. We got about 25 people to show up in a room. We got them modules assigned, and their job was to get at least one pull request created by the end of the day on GitHub. We had something like 30 or 40 pull requests by the end of the day. Some of them were tiny little typo fixes. Some of them were really nice new featured things that people had worked on. And this was just a very informal hackathon we did at work. And you could do the same thing in whatever your favorite language or set of libraries or system or tool set is. This is going to be kind of obvious. Yes. You don't need to wait. All of these things are out there right now. You don't have to be intimidated by what you don't currently know. Just go and do something. Go and find something to contribute to. So now what do you contribute, right? So I've been kind of scratching around the surface of this. If you're a developer, maybe you develop. If you're a writer, maybe you could write some documentation. But it doesn't have to be code. For those of you who did not raise your hand when I asked for developers, or for those of you who want to get into communities where something is written in a language you're totally unfamiliar with, you don't have to start with writing code. You don't have to go and fix bugs or write new features. You can do documentation. Well, let me give you a whole bunch of bullets I've got here. So you can just report a bug. Maybe it's you're using jQuery and it's not doing what you want it to do. Just go and write up a bug for that. Or go and find somebody who's reported the same bug but did a crappy job of explaining how to reproduce it and fill out a better comment that tells the developers how to reproduce that. You can use code triage or just do it yourself to triage existing bugs to make sure the developers aren't wasting their time on things that aren't valuable to them. You can just suggest a new feature, open an issue on GitHub or elsewhere. You can also do translation. How many people in here speak a language other than English? A few. Other than English and Spanish? A few more, or a few less, but So in particular, if you know a language other than English or Spanish, you're very much needed in so many different open source communities, I couldn't count it, to do translation. How many times have you used an application that had, you know, some very generic list of we support English, Spanish, German, and French? Well, that's nice. That covers a large portion of the population, but not really. You know, it doesn't cover Asian languages. It doesn't cover huge portions of the world. So if you happen to know any of those languages, if you know enough that you could do translation, that's a great place to go as well. Documentation. Improving, just improving on existing things, fixing typos, cleaning things up, making them prettier, converting them to Markdown or whatever the style of that particular repo is so that they're prettier, nicer, better laid out, better styled. You can go to Stack Overflow and you can answer questions. Stack Overflow forums, whatever the source may be, and just answer questions about that software or that project or whatever it is. If you happen to be a user of it, you know it well, you don't have to be building something, creating something to be contributing. You can write a blog saying how awesome jQuery is. You can also write a blog saying, okay, I needed to use jQuery in order to accomplish this thing, but it didn't work quite right. So I plugged in jQuery with this other thing and this other plugin and this thing, and I wrote this little bit of code, and I finally got it all to work, and here's all the stuff I did in case anybody else comes along Googling later and finds your blog about it. And of course, you can always show up at a conference and waste everybody's hour giving a presentation. Okay, what else? Let's say you can code. A whole bunch of you raised your hands as developers. So what can you do? Maybe you don't know the code base well enough to actually start diving in and adding new things. So you can write some tests, improve the test coverage. You know, there's a lot of open source projects out there that have very minimal tests written so far. They might have a few unit tests for a few core libraries, but they don't have good functional integration testing. I mean, obviously you're not going to necessarily be wanting to stand up servers and everything for them to do full integration testing, but maybe you can contribute a little bit to that, make some headway for them, make things a little bit easier. This also will likely lead you down the path of finding bugs. When you write a test and you're expecting it to work and then it doesn't, there's a path for you to go down to find some code to contribute. Go through the GitHub issues. See if you can cherry pick something that's been sitting in there for a few years that's just some minor little thing that you think you can handle. You can clean up code to follow a standard. I mentioned before, lint, JSLint, procritic, those kinds of things. Now, be warned, if you jump into a well-established project with a lot of people writing to a particular code standard, and you say, no, all of your curlies need to be cuddled, here's a giant pull request that recuddles all of your curlies and elses across your entire 50 million line code base, it's probably going to get rejected. But on smaller projects, especially if you can see that they're not really following any particular standard, they don't have a documented standard, and your language has a preferred way of writing certain code, and theirs is mostly there but not quite right, run it through some kind of static analysis, some kind of lint type software, clean it up, Perl tidy, and submit that back, and maybe it'll get accepted. Fix a bug that affects you. It's always easier to dive into code when you have a real reason and a purpose behind it. And again, writing a new feature doesn't have to be a bug, just could be something you wish that whatever, that it did one more thing. So what's a pull request? Who in here has never submitted a pull request? Got 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. Got a little bit more honest there after a minute. Pull requests. So Git, and this Git is a whole topic there. I'm sure there are whole tracks here at the conference about Git. Git as a distributed system is not like you might be used to with CVS or Subversion or other centralized repositories where in order to make a change to the repository, you have to have write access to be able to make a commit and submit that to the repository. Git is distributed, so there's maybe one canonical repo somewhere, but you can then make a copy of that repo, you can make changes to your copy of that repo, and then you could submit a pull request back to the core repo, to the maintainers of that, that says, hey, look at this cool code I wrote over here in my own copy of your repo. You should check that out, and if they like it, then they can pull that code into their repo, hence the name pull request. So you are requesting that they pull your code into their repo. It sounds scary, but it's really quite trivial. And if you're using something like GitHub, it's extremely trivial. There's a button. When you commit code and you push that code from your laptop or wherever you're working up to GitHub, there is literally a button that shows up that says, would you like to make a pull request? Just click that button. That's it. Obviously, GitHub is the place to do this in particular. Bitbucket is another common one. It's very possible you'll also find other repos out there. There's still people using code.google. There's still people using that one that I just lost the name of, and 100 others. So by no means is GitHub everything, but a lot of things are now on GitHub. A lot of people have switched to Git or other distributed systems. So this is the most common way that you're going to encounter now, today, that you would be using to contribute to some kind of open source project. And this article right here is awesome. So they have a different article that you might find if you Googled just pull requests that actually says how to do a pull request and how to click the button. This article here, help.github.com/articles/using-pull-requests, is more about the concept of a pull request. What is it? Why are we doing it? Why does it benefit you? Why does it benefit the maintainers of the other repos? So that's a great article to get started on if you've never done a pull request. So that is my very shorter than I planned presentation. I talk a little too fast sometimes. Any questions? Anybody? Yeah?
Which open source projects do you contribute to?
So most of the ones that I'm working on right now are Perl modules, Perl libraries, because that's the language I use in my day-to-day job. So I've done that. I've also done a few things in JavaScript as kind of one of the other languages I play in personally, but those are usually pretty trivial. Most of the stuff I've worked on of late is Perl. Yeah?
First of all, I just kind of want to reiterate at least one point that came to mind when you were saying, and you kind of mentioned it, but I found, for me, it's been really helpful, and I feel like I'm contributing, at least, when like I solve a weird problem, or like I have a really unique use case for like a piece of software. Like most recent example that I can remember is like Chef Solo. I was trying to get to work, and the documentation for it is severely lacking. But I feel like I contribute when when it's hard for me to learn something, and then I post a blog post, kind of like what I wish, like the article I wish I would have found. You know what I mean? And I think you touched a lot on that, but that's been pretty helpful for me.
Yeah, it worked out kind of strangely, but I encountered a blog post back around February or so that was looking at a current existing module that was written in C and wishing that it did this one other thing. It was a module written in C that did some static parsing analysis of Perl, and the guy had written a blog post about it saying, I wish it would do this, and I'm starting to kind of hack around in this, but I don't really know C all that well. I happen to know enough C that I thought I could dive in and do it. So I went and wrote something in this module in C to solve the problem that he had. I went to go and submit him a pull request, and I realized that he'd already solved the problem himself in more or less the same way and had merged it up into the repo. So my code never actually went anywhere. I ended up just throwing that branch away. But I learned a lot in going through that process. I got to, dive back into C, which is not something I use on a day-to-day basis. I enjoyed doing that. It was beneficial to me in that personal growth bullet point. And I think it was also beneficial to the community in having this blog post and having that information out there, and then there being an improvement to that module. So yeah, writing up a blog post about problems you run into, whether or not you solve them, can be beneficial for other people.
I think Stack Exchange and Stack Overflow
Yeah.
is probably another good resource for that type of stuff too.
Absolutely. Any other questions? So I have one question for you guys. Did anybody happen to notice all of the little typos scattered throughout my presentation?
Maybe not all of them.
Did you count them?
I thought they were witnesses.
A few of them were. Some of them were just being obnoxious. So if this were an open source project, and I've put these slides up on SlideShare, but it doesn't matter to anybody to fix them. But if this were an open source project, those kind of little things that you were seeing that were annoying you are a perfect starting point to dive in and go and fix them. It doesn't matter that they're as trivial as little typos. That's something that you can do that is a contribution that gets you started, dives you into somebody else's code, documentation, repo project, whatever it is, and gets you started in that direction. So when you find you're mildly annoyed by somebody else's mistakes, and we're all probably a little OCD in here, think about that as a place to start. And here's a list of sources. Again, I put these up online. I didn't think to put a link to my SlideShare link inside of the slides. That's a little meta, but would have been smart. But I can give you a copy of this, or I can find the link online afterwards. These are all blog posts and other things that I used as sources for all of the things I talked in here. And they often go into certain portions of this in more depth, if you're interested. So that's it. Thank you all for coming.